Welcome to the Private Practice Alchemy video podcast series, where I help you work smarter and earn more in your ideal therapy practice. I'm your alchemist and host, Jennifer Kennett. My guest today is Dafna Chen of the Pivotal Center. Dafna is the owner and clinical director of Pivotal Center, a group practice catering to supporting relationships in the area of sexuality and trauma recovery. She's a certified sex therapist and substance use disorder professional. Today we're discussing niching, specifically how to combine seemingly disparate areas of training into a unique therapy niche. All right, welcome to Cultivating Your Ideal Private Practice, and I am interviewing Dafna Chen today. She is a therapist with specialties in sexuality, in substance use, and also in trauma. And she is also the owner of the Pivotal Center, and that is a group practice here in the greater Seattle area. So welcome, Dafna. I really appreciate you coming on and being willing to be interviewed. And my first question for you is, when you hear experts say niching is important, what's your gut response to that?
Yeah, I guess my gut response to that today is very different than when I started out. Today, I am in total agreement, and I can tell you a little bit about how I got there. Mm-hmm. When I was a very young clinician in the field, my gut was like, yeah, no, I want to learn more. I want to serve everybody. I want to be able to offer everything. And I see that also with my clinicians, that when they're coming on, that is one of the initial struggles for us to kind of like, how do we cultivate a specific direction that people go in? And I think it's really important to note that niching is not, this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. It's more, for me, it's more about being very clear about what I want to focus my attention in, and being very clear with clients what I do and what I do not do.
Well, and I love what you just said, which is that so often new clinicians are hungry for knowledge. And so the idea of narrowing their focus feels like they're saying, I don't want to learn. And yet what your niching is really about, like you said, is about saying, this is what I'm really good at. This is what I love to do. This is how I'm going to show up best. And yes, there are always going to be more areas that I'm going to learn about. And my niche may change over time.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean that I should be saying I'm everything to everyone.
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what led you to choose trauma, substance use, and sexuality as your areas of focus?
Yeah. Well, I think trauma, all of these three are things that show up for most of our clients. Mm. And all of these three are things that a lot of therapists are not as educated in when they come out finishing their master level or even PhD level. We learn very basic things, we learn very basic skills, but not necessarily understanding deeply the dynamic that comes with substance use, with yourself, with the loved one. Trauma, in my mind, is the base to a lot of mental health issue. Mm-hmm. And sexuality. You know, we're all humans, so that's kind of a given. So my own journey with it was just recognizing how much comorbidity exists, especially when it comes to trauma, mental health, and substance use. That's where I started. And once I got educated in that was kind of a no-brainer that everybody needs to know this kind of a thing. And so after working in the field and decided to also go to educating other people in that, if it's as teacher, instructor in a university, or as a group owner, part of why I opened the group is to make sure that the clinicians that work for me are well educated, well ready to work with this kind of population. And sexuality is another piece. Like in school, I chose to do more of education in that. And again, 100% of our people, 100% of our clients would have that as part of their life. It doesn't mean that they struggle with it, but it is part of their life. an influential part in their life a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And so being able to, if nothing else, speak confidently in that area and not block that. Like, it was very interesting to me when I started working as a sex therapist, how clients I've seen for a while suddenly started speaking about it, which,
interesting,
right, it's how we bring about permission to speak about these areas that are really a lot of people shy away from.
Yeah.
So.
And I mean, you're right. In general society, those are three areas where there is a lot of judgment. There's a lot of opinions that are pretty negative and pretty harsh. And so as therapists, if we're not able to bring a clarity and compassion to our or to our clients about these issues, how can we expect them to show up and really be able to do that work?
Right. There's so much shame in those. So yeah, for me, that was a very basic one.
Yeah. So that goes on to the next question, like how do you see these areas interconnected? And you just mentioned shame. Can you speak a bit more on that?
Yeah. And, you know, when you talk about mental health, mental wellness, a lot of the time we talk about, is something wrong with me? Is something off with me? And really, I think the notion of your reaction is very normal to a very abnormal situation you lived with. And it can be small traumas like mismatch between you and the parent or the caregiver that you had.
Right.
And it might be a bigger trauma of if it's abuse or harsh relationship or a specific event that happened. When I say to people I work in these three areas, they immediately go to sexual trauma. Sometimes that's something I work with, not necessarily. I think trauma is based to a lot of substance use issues. You can see people try their best to deal with what they experienced. And sometimes substance use is the kind of short-term patch for them dealing with things. And then substance use is also something that creates a lot of trauma when it's done to excess.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
yeah. And then sexuality is a bigger topic, obviously. It can be a lot of different things that has nothing to do with the other two.
Yeah, well, and I can imagine that trauma experience, as you say, either big traumas or small traumas, will show up in our intimate relationships, even if our intimate relationships are close and positive. Because of that shame piece, and also because there is such difficulty in our society talking about sexuality. It's seen as inherently shameful or inherently taboo, and so I can imagine that just becomes yet another barrier. And so breaking down that barrier by acknowledging the trauma may help clients kind of get comfortable with who they are, be safe in their own skin again.
Yeah, and it's with themselves, first of all, of course, and also, as you say, in relationship to other people, especially intimate relationship. That's where we see it really showing up a lot, right? So you might be fine elsewhere because you're detached a little bit more emotionally and you are able to contain a lot of things, but you might be much more triggered to old patterns, to trauma patterns when you are in more intimate relationship and things come up that feels much more activating.
Yeah. So I guess one of the pieces that is challenging but really critical is how do you communicate to your client or potential clients the connection between these three, so that they're not sort of self-selecting out immediately going, oh, I don't have sexual trauma, so this isn't right for me. So what sort of language works for sort of communicating your niche?
Well, I think what I'm talking about always, and I think that's true for any niche, it's not just the areas that I'm focused on, is what is the needs? What would people see in their life that is a problem? And that's why they seek services. So it's not about what happened necessarily, not the story of what happened or the clinical jargon that we all use. It's not about that. It's more about how do we really relate and understand and communicate that understanding to potential clients. Right? Yeah.
What are the sorts of things that your clients will show up and say in maybe an initial session? These are the kinds of things that I'm really struggling with. How does this show up, I guess?
Yeah, it can be, you know, the drinking doesn't work anymore, or my wife sent me here, or right, and that's like, okay, let's talk about how is this relevant for you, or there is a mismatch between how I see the world and my partner, and those are couples that usually are like already in awareness of what's happening. It might be just we fight too much. We want to go back to old ways, right? It might be this is out of control and I don't know what to do anymore. Yeah. It might be a lot of different pieces, but really at the base of it is that sense of I feel stuck and not hopeful about dealing with this alone. If it's asking for guidance in the sense of information, but more than anything, I think it's more, can I find this safe place to share, work with, to process, and know that I'm not judged and I'm acceptable, and there wouldn't be any consequences that impact my life later.
Right. And that's, I think, a really good point is as therapists, we do need to communicate that power of and I know the term has been used of objectivity, and it's not actually objectivity, but that there's a bit of distance. And so if somebody comes to you as a therapist and says, this is where my life is going wrong, there's not a risk that you're going to all of a sudden make choices that are going to affect their life. Whereas if they are able, if they try to say something to a family member, they have a risk of rejection or even losing that connection entirely. And so I think that space that is a little bit more contained and also it's safe because there isn't that immediate, I could lose this person and or other parts of my life that are really important to me.
Right. And this is for processing, really, right? It's not about, I want to be this and then I hide it from the world, but more, I need to figure out who and what I want to be and how do I show up in that way, or what doesn't work in my life anymore, and what would be maybe more effective ways to live my life. And and I'll just say I'm very much for bringing other people to therapy as needed, as the client wants, in the time that fits them, because that the relationship they have in their life, that's the real stuff.
Right.
We are kind of the in-between time, right? That's the place where they can sit and think about and consider other options and what really fits authentically to them.
I'm thinking a bit about some of the things you're saying clients show up with. And I think because you have the substance use training and you advertise that as part of your skill set, those things, clients may show up that are clear that's an issue. I know in my own work as a couples therapist, because I've worked in addictions in the past, I ask the question. I mean, it's supposed to be part of your assessment, but I ask fairly detailed questions from a place of, so how often are you drinking? Or how, if you're using recreational drugs, what does that look like? And I'm often surprised at how completely ignorant clients are of what the line is for use that is not potentially risky and use that is becoming problematic. And even just talking about the SAMHSA safe drinking guidelines. I've had couples who are just eyes like dinner plates, going, seriously, there are safe drinking guidelines, and I'm way beyond that. And so it opens the door, and I can see how for some of those clients, they may not show up again because they're like, I didn't realize that. But having a therapist who already knows how to manage that and talk about that in a very calm way really will help people. Even if they weren't coming for that piece, there's a safety in knowing that their therapist has that training.
Definitely, and I'll just say two things. One is it was surprising to me how many therapists are lacking that knowledge. And that is where, that's where I feel very called for really educating other people as much as possible. in that, in specifically substance use. And also, I think the same goes for sexuality. Having questions about sexuality in your intake paperwork, in your initial conversation with people, communicates to them, hey, I'm willing to talk about this. If you want to step into here or not, that's up to you. But I am willing, I'm comfortable with that. And I think a lot of us forget about that.
That's very true.
Yeah.
And I guess going back to the marketing side, how about that for language on your website or in your initial calls? Are there ways that you can include that sort of signal to potential clients, this is an open door for you?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what we learned, all of us learned in grad school. We learn about normalizing. We learn about empathy. We learned about how to really sit and understand the other person and communicate that to them. It's not enough that we feel empathy. It's important for us to communicate that. Same goes with the language. So I use the same skill set. And really, people are shying away from marketing because like, oh, this big thing. I'm like, what? This big thing is exactly what we do every day.
Right.
Just in a different form, right? How do we communicate to people that, yeah, it feels hopeless sometimes when you in the morning decide, I'm not going to drink anymore. And by night time, you're in the very same place as you were yesterday, right? Or if you feel so much shame about, I don't know, masturbating so many times or not. And is this normal, right? That normal thing is another piece. How do we normalize things? And when do we call out, you know, this might be a problem? So it's the empathy and education piece that needs to be, in my mind, in our communication with clients, if it's website or otherwise.
Well, and I love that you're really focusing on how do we communicate to our clients or our prospective clients from from the very first moment they're interacting with some version of us, whether it's on a website or whatever else. And I love the concept of sort of creating an avatar, sort of who is this client you're talking to, and writing letters or writing content specifically for them. I get so frustrated when I see therapists who are writing all about me as a means of trying to communicate, I'm here for you. And I certainly, when I read it, I'm like, okay, I'm not quite sure how you know me. And as a potential client, that's what I'm looking for, not is this person qualified. I'm going to assume that if a person is a therapist, they're qualified.
Right.
And maybe an erroneous assumption, but still.
That's the thing. I think first of all, none of us necessarily sign up to be business people and understand that this is also a business. Yes. So understanding what that means. And I think that fear base, that sense of this is not something I know how to do. And then we look around and we see those not so great examples of trying to communicate, I am valuable, I can do something for you in a way that doesn't really read by people as, oh, you really get me. Yeah. Right? And I think that was, for me, a very big learning early on when I just started, how to do this in a better way. And it's no different. Again, it's that there was some relief in knowing that it's no different than what we are already doing. Yeah. Anyway, it's just how to translate that into our writing, into our communication, into our networking, all of it.
Exactly. And I love that point about networking, because honestly, my experience, the people that I want to get to know best in a networking interaction are the ones who are interested in me and ask me questions, and then can connect who they are, what they do, to the answers that I've given. So how to prove that, how to communicate I am valuable to you is I'm interested in you to start with. And I think that you're right, that when therapists make that connection, their marketing improves dramatically.
Definitely.
Especially when you've got that sense of, not only can I say, I'm interested in you, but I can pull out what matters to you. Right. And if I'm not the right person, I can very clearly say, hey, I think that what you need is really clear, and let me make that connection for you.
Right. Let me connect you to a better resource.
Exactly.
And I really love the notion of a fit. What is a good fit? Right? Is this a good fit? I'll just say from my experience, and I have tried it, I can say very clearly, I have tried roaming into places that are not my specialty, and that was not a good thing, not for me and not for the client. And so ethically, I think it's really important for us to know what we are able to do. And it's not that you can't necessarily do, but is this really something that you feel alive and passionate about working with these clients, right? And I think ideally that's what we're aiming for. Because it's not about just filling up my clinic and, oh, I have a paycheck. It's how most of us come to this work with a lot of meaning. Most of us come to this work with a lot of wish to help. So I know that I can help here much better than I can help there. And I'm feeling much more alive by this when I'm with what we call ideal clients.
Exactly.
That's something that fits me, yeah.
And I think that's the other place with those new therapists is acknowledging, look, you don't necessarily have the experience of what works and what doesn't for you.
That's right.
And so at that point, choosing a niche that is based in your initial training is a great plan. Like saying, you know, I really love working with depression. That may be something that for the first 2-3 years in your practice you work with because you've got good solid foundation in it. And then you discover, you know what, there's this other area that I keep having show up. I want to know more. I'm going to step into that over time. And that niche becomes either more narrow or it shifts.
Exactly.
And I think that that's something that when you are able to let new therapists know, look, this will grow. It's okay to say, this is my choice today. And it doesn't have to, as you say, be the choice for the rest of your life.
Right. In a way, if you look at my career, that's exactly what happened. It's like somebody else actually reflected to me. At some point, I was just graduating and had already the substance use education. And we just chatted, me and a peer, and she said, oh, what's your niche? And I'm like, I don't know at this point. And she's like, well, you're coming from Israel. You know a lot about trauma from there. Substance use definitely connected to that. And this is the people you work with. At the time, I worked with methadone clinic clients. And she was like, trauma. And I was like, okay. And then I started thinking about what does that mean to be niche in trauma? What does that mean to be an expert in trauma? And it's not just about knowing trauma, but knowing how to work with trauma, right? What does that, and it is a very different thing than a lot of other things. Same with substance use. There is very specific dynamics that you learn about when you really get into that. And sexuality is a very big world. What in that are you doing, right?
Yeah.
There's just not enough clinicians in that area. So it's an interesting one. Are you generic in your niche also?
Absolutely.
Right? Or am I doing substance use just with people who struggle with it, or the people that have loved ones that are substance use users, right? So a lot of thoughts around that, and definitely something that keeps on growing and changing as we go.
Well, I love that as well, because again, for newer therapists or therapists who struggle with the concept of niche, the idea of, well, I'm going to choose depression as my niche. It's like, okay, that's a very, very big area. And how do you show up? How do you say, I have this particular twist or this particular take on it that will speak to your ideal client? Because that does make a difference. And really getting clear. The other thing I loved about what you said is that somebody else reflected back to you a really valuable piece of information. So I want to acknowledge that that's sometimes the best source of our, our awareness of who we are, is when somebody else reflects back and goes, hey, this is how I see you. And it allows us to really go, oh.
Yeah.
So what would be your recommendation to a therapist who is planning on going out on their own? They have different areas of interest, and they're struggling with this concept of niche.
Yeah, I think it's about a little bit of reflection. Sometimes it's hard to know, especially when you work generic with people. Like, oh, I have teens and I have children and I have parents and I have couples and I don't know what I'm about. It's okay, by the way, I want to say it's very okay to say I'm a generalist and that's what I love to do. Totally fine. If you want to be more clear about where you want to learn, what you want to invest in, then look at the people that you already work with. Where do you feel more, oh, this is really interesting for me, or I want to learn more about this, and this feels more alive for me. I really, when I'm looking forward to a connection with this person. And if that is not just that person, but specific area, right? So that might be a really good clue. Also, what do you like to learn about? What do you enjoy learning and exploring about? That would be another one. Yeah, it's kind of like anything else. You look for different hints, different ways.
Right.
But definitely, look at what groups you choose to be part of. If it's Facebook or consult groups, or where do you lean to? And it might be just a little bit. Like when I started with substances, I did not anticipate that would be my main thing. I have to tell you, I went to the training, which was really extensive, but I didn't necessarily said this is what I'm going to do the rest of my life. I'm still not knowing that that's the thing I'll do the rest of my life, but I have to tell you, so many years later, I feel like that is definitely a big part of what I'm always going to do, because I know about this enough and I feel of use with that. So if nothing else, even if I chose not to work in substance use ever again, any client that comes see me have the benefit that I have that layer with me.
Exactly.
Do you know personally, I would assume?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, my first 10 years in the business was very much focused on substance use. And I'm so glad I have that experience. But it's certainly, it shows up in my practice, but it's not something that I use as a niche point any longer. And I appreciate that sort of self-reflection. I think for me, being a private practice owner is the best self-development program I've ever been in.
I'm with you there.
Because it gives us a tremendously clear space to be looking at where are our challenges, where are the things that we need to work on, as well as where are the places that we can really sparkle and find our joy.
Right.
So, how do you see your niche growing and in terms of your professional development over the next 2 to 3 years?
Yeah, I actually am 1 month away from applying to my ASECT certificate, which is a sex therapist certificate. And in the last 2 years, thank you. In the last 2 years, that was my focus on really learning and expanding on that area. And so I think more and more have clarity there on what in that big world of sexuality do I want to focus on. I also more and more go back to how I want to educate other people around those things, if it's lay people, if it's clinicians. So it's another learning of its own, right? How do you, while I taught in university before, how do you do that when it's not in that kind of structured place?
Right.
So professionally, I see those two areas where I want to grow in, how to effectively share information and learning with people, and how to be very much more clear about in sexuality, what are areas that I want to serve in.
Well, and I love that that's another way to niche, in fact, is it's not just what we work with, but also how we work with it. Yeah. So, being an educator is somewhat different than being a therapist. And so that, I think for therapists in private practice, recognizing you need to be thinking about more than just the content, but also the method that you're focusing on. I mean, I see more and more therapists talking about niching as teletherapists, which, thanks to COVID-19, is really become an option. But again, there's like, okay, I'm going to do teletherapy. There's value in being a generalist, but there is also value in saying I do teletherapy in these areas.
Right.
So.
Right. And I think that specifically is definitely an area that can, on the one hand, open the market quite a bit. If you talk about business, right? You can, we're in the state of Washington, it can be all of Washington versus, the city and maybe the city next to me kind of a thing. On the flip side, that also means that because substance use counselors and sex therapists are so rare in the state of Washington, and not just, but definitely in the state of Washington, you now have offered very valuable services to many more people. Right. So how to scale that, that's another thing, because end of the day, I have so many hours of the week I can work in, right? So how do I offer some of the wisdom that is already there to everyone? Right. And then the next level is like, how do you offer really services, maybe through teaching other clinicians to do the same work?
Yeah, and I think that's a piece that so many therapists look at. They get into private practice and they realize that trading time for dollars only goes so far because there are only so many hours. And there's also some, this is all about money story, but there's some sense that we have a ceiling on how much we can charge per hour. And so, yes, going from the one-to-one to a one-to-many model is one that I think a number of therapists consider and really struggle with how to make that leap. So I'm sure that'll be a topic in a future interview.
Sure. I think it's the money and also the services, right? It's like, if you think about even money as a way to help other people, maybe you don't, it's kind of like if I do group therapy versus I do individual therapy, right? Now I'm serving maybe 10, 12 people versus one.
Right.
How does that work? Or workshops, right? And how to allow people to get in and get some of the information, some of the experience, if they can't afford the full experience, right?
Right. Or they're hesitant. And that's the other piece of this is that there's often potential clients who want to sort of take you for a test drive, and being able to provide good content at a relatively easy, low barrier to entry point can be very valuable as well.
Yeah.
I can't count the number of clients I've gotten from doing presentations. Somebody comes up at the end and it's like, "Are you taking new clients?" And it's a very simple way of doing that.
Yeah. And I think, the same concept that you talk about is like, I think some marketing person I learned from said, it's dating versus the marriage proposal. Right? It's like, how do we give you some sense of who we are before you buy into coming in?
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Well, Dafna, thank you so much. I really appreciate all of your wisdom and insight. Can you share with my audience your contact information?
Sure. So the easiest way to find us is on the web, pivotalcenter.com. And if you want to call us, it's 206-432-4232 is the phone number. And you can reach me at those locations as well.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And how many therapists do you have working for you at this point?
Right now we have 2, and we're considering hiring a third one right now. So, yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much.
Definitely. Thank you, Jen.
Look forward to chatting with you again.
Of course.
Thanks for joining me today. If you're ready to work smarter and earn more money in your ideal therapy practice, book a 30-minute free coaching call with me. Visit my website at privatepracticealchemy.com and click on the big purple Schedule Time with Me button. And if you're in your first year of private practice, sign up for the next cohort of my 90-day Private Practice Alchemy Accelerator Group. Groups start in January, May, and September. You can register for the next cohort on my website. Thanks for listening.